Human. That's basically everyone that was in the room for the last session is going, yay, we are Team Human. Everyone else is going, should we know what this is? Is this a thing? It's a thing. Ask Doug Rushkoff, he'll tell you all about it. Well, we have another lightning talk for you. That's not the official name, it's just what I'm calling them. It's 20 minutes of pure, intense goodness of thought. No time for questions, but you can rate the sessions afterwards if you're into that kind of reductive digital metrication. Again, sorry for people who weren't here in the last session. You're going, what? The next speaker had such a long biography that he just asked me to cut half of it out. So, Geoff Mulgan is the chief executive of Nesta, which has organised this event. So that's obviously quite important. Exactly, yes, nods of agreement to the front. He's been chief executive since 2011. Between 1997, so back in the last millennium for you younger people, and 2004, he had various advisory roles in the UK government. And since then, he has set up many organisations, including Demos, the Young Foundation, Social Innovation Exchange, Uprising, Studio Schools Trust, and Action for Happiness. Because who doesn't want more happiness? But what he's going to talk to you now is a newish project called the Centre for Collective Intelligence Design. So please welcome Geoff Mulgan.
Well, thank you, human beings. Hopefully you've got some food, or maybe you're the ones who don't need food because you're not actually human beings, and for giving up a part of your lunchtime to hear about some themes which really follow directly on from what Doug Rushkoff was talking about. What I'm going to address is, in a sense, beyond the internet, beyond Wikipedia, how do we create the tools for thinking at larger scale, which is then the precondition for solving the big problems of health or education or poverty or war. And I put on the screen a picture of a brain. In a way, the question is, how do we get thinking at larger scale? That's one reason for having the picture. The other is there is very strong evidence from neuroscience that if you put a picture of a brain in your presentation, your audience is 25% more likely to believe everything you say afterwards. So you're being manipulated already, and it is lunchtime. What I'm going to talk about follows on from many of the conversations yesterday about AI and data, the flood of Watson's, DeepMind's, driverless cars which surround us, many coming from the US, but also the Chinese version, Alipay, facial recognition, so on, in many ways moving faster than the Western version. But my interest, as with Doug, is how do we get the human element, how do we combine the extraordinary potential of AI and data and machine learning with what goes on in your heads, hopefully. And there's actually a great tradition of thinking about collective intelligence. Some of you will recognize this picture from the 19th century. Francis Galton famously went to a country fair, observed that the public guess of the weight of a cow was almost precisely accurate, much more accurate than the cow experts could guess, and out of this came the notion of a wisdom of crowds. At about the same time in the 19th century, there was in fact an amazing collective intelligence project called the Oxford English Dictionary, which mobilized tens of thousands of volunteers to study texts from the Middle Ages, the 18th century, and really map the entire history of the English language. Almost everything Wikipedia did was actually prefigured by the Oxford English Dictionary more than 100 years before. So there's a fantastic long history of how to organize thought at very large scale involving very large numbers of people. More recently, we've had lots of experiments like NASA's Red Balloon Challenge, where they hid red balloons across the US and gave a prize to teams who could come up with methods for finding them. Every time one of these experiments was done, things like balloons were found within a few hours as people came up with clever ways of mobilizing crowds of strangers to solve problems. And there are many other examples, like in healthcare, there's Dana Lewis, who managed to mobilize a whole community to help design an artificial pancreas, share data on the pancreas, a collective intelligence alternative to what was not being provided very well by the medical profession. And in business, there's some really good examples like Duolingo, which many of you probably have used, free online tool for learning languages. What's maybe less visible is they also have a collective intelligence strand where they encourage volunteers to create new language pairs, like Spanish to Mongolian, let's say, and then reward some of those with translation work. So they're both a business, but also mobilizing crowds of strangers to help create new value. So this field is becoming incredibly fertile and dynamic alongside the AI, the machine learning, the digital stuff. And what it's prompted us to do is to try and think in more detail, what is it that's happening when thought really happens at scale? In a city, in a company, in a charity, in a university. How do we rethink of the elements which come together to make true collective intelligence? And rather as happens in your brains, though maybe not on a hot Saturday afternoon, there are quite a few things going on. There is observation, data, seeing what's happening in the world. You have to have some live model of what you're expecting to happen to make sense of the data. There'll be analysis and prediction, memory, motor coordination, hopefully, empathy, rather important in human life, creativity, judgment, and wisdom. And my guess is that if you think of anyone who you would respect as intelligent, they probably have all of these things and are able to apply them to different domains of their life. And I think what counts as collective intelligence is exactly the same, is the ability at scale, a company, a city, a university, to be able to do all of these things well. Now, much of the conversation here has been about technology, and obviously technology is transforming some of these hugely, and others not really much at all. Huge transformation of observation, of prediction, of memory, a little bit on creativity, very little so far on judgment and wisdom. And we spot that organizations which are over-focused on just the data or just the analysis can make really stupid mistakes and completely lack in wisdom. So one of the issues we've been looking at is the balance of these different things. How do you cultivate them individually, but how do you also pull them together? Now, part of the excitement in the field is the spread of new tools for doing some of these using collective intelligence. So here's an example from Indonesia, Peta Jakarta. Here, citizens map the state of flooding in the city, and they upload them to the Peta Jakarta website. So the city's, seeing itself, the city brain is observing flood patterns more efficiently than the city authorities could do on their own. And there are thousands of examples of these kinds now where citizen-generated observation combines with official or indeed corporate observation to offer new insights. We also have the extraordinary field of citizen science like Zooniverse, based here in the UK, mobilizing millions of people to look at the stars and make sense of astronomy or cancer tumors or the state of birds in your back gardens. This is a really exciting mobilization of observation at huge scale. We've also got lots of things happening on creativity. We host at Nesta Challenges.org, and our Challenge Prize Center poses problems and then lets anyone anywhere in the world come up with solutions. The Longitude Prize you might have heard of, which now has 200 teams globally competing to come up with diagnostics for bacterial diseases. These are ones from the last week or two on social innovation in Europe, or inventors, or a serious farming disease in sub-Saharan Africa, the fall armyworm. And these are new tools which mobilize crowd brains at vastly larger scale than was ever possible before. So an organization doesn't have to just rely on the people it employs. And of course, there's a huge explosion of tools for memory. We all use Wikipedia. In some ways, more interesting than that now are things like WikiHouse, which we've supported, which creates a global repository of building designs. So if you want to build a new house, you can download from WikiHouse, and hopefully then you upload the design you actually create. May put some architects out of business, but in a sense it's trying to turn architecture into a truly global collective intelligence. And there are many examples of this kind of using technology and organizational design to mobilize a much larger brain to solve problems. Now, one of the things you quickly find in these fields, and one of the, I think, the blind spots of a lot of the tech discussion of this, is that real meaningful intelligence involves what I call learning loops. There's a first loop of learning, which computers are very good at, where you adapt your thought and action within an existing framework. You have an algorithm, new data comes in, you adapt where the car drives or how you interpret a visual signal. But a lot of everyday intelligence is really second loop learning, where we create new categories, new models to think with. And you can argue almost all of human progress has been coming up with new categories like human rights or carbon and climate change, and then using those to think with. And as yet, we have almost no digital tools which can do second loop learning. And third loop learning is when you run into barriers and have to really rethink how you think altogether. And this is, again, hugely important for real institutions trying to navigate their way through complex environments. And in the business world, in government, in academia, there have been successive revolutions essentially rethinking how to think. But again, we don't yet have any AI which can do that. AI is part of how we rethink how to think, but it can't actually do the design of the rethinking itself. So a crucial sort of missing bit of a lot of the AI story is that true intelligence at scale on the things that matter most to us involves first, second, and third loop learning. And at the moment, there's huge investment in the first, but very little serious attention to the second and third, which is why we often see very smart institutions with lots of technology doing very dumb things. And of course, this isn't new. It's a really striking feature of recent history that often the sectors and organizations which had the smartest people and had spent the most on computers and algorithms and so on, most misread the world they were in and made the biggest mistakes. Finance in the late 2000s being a case in point, but there are quite a few others we could think of. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, collective intelligence is always in a competitive environment. There will always be people trying to misinform, to distort, to undermine thought at scale. And I think we're becoming much more really attuned to this, perhaps than the internet idealists were 10 or 20 years ago, that we live in a world of fake news, of disinformation, of cyber attacks, and always we have to protect our systems. We need immune systems which protect against the threats coming from them. Now, again, that is in part a design question. How do you design your systems so they're not vulnerable to fake news, cyber attacks, misinformation? But this is a new field. So where we're taking this in our work is shaped in part by this concept of intelligence assemblies. So what you do in your own brains, hopefully, even on a Saturday afternoon, is link together your observation, your analysis, your memory, your action in an integrated way. The brilliance of the human brain is its interconnectedness of your 82 billion neurons, far more than any computing system can be. And our question is, for anything that matters, like public health, or unemployment, or democracy, how can we design intelligent systems which link all of these things together? The data, the predictions and models, the analysis, the memory, the creativity. And this is a far more challenging task than a Wikipedia, which is just one part of that, or the internet, or blockchain even, which is in some ways a memory tool, but really not much help for most of those other things. And that's led us to try and search for what are the good examples which are pointers to a possible future where this is done better. Now, a good example is one we probably use every day, you might have used to get here, which is Google Maps, which many people assume was a brilliant invention of Google, and in some ways it was. What's less well known is that Google had missed many of the key skills for doing Google Maps, and so bought up a whole series of companies which brought with them new tools for scrollable maps and Google Earth and Street View. With Google Maps API, they opened up so that programmers could link Google Maps into thousands, hundreds of thousands of websites. Through Google Map Maker, They opened it up so the public could fill in the missing bits in the global map. And in many ways, Google Maps is an assembly. It is a representation of the world, but it's an assembly of multiple elements which then become useful because of the way they're curated and assembled. Now, there are quite a few examples in other fields emerging. Some false starts, like the Planetary Skin Institute, which NASA and Cisco developed at the beginning of the decade, which tried to be a global nervous system, observing the state of rainforests and oceans and feeding into action. In Europe, we have Copernicus, funded with billions of euros, which is a very good observation tool for, again, all of Europe's environment, but missing many of the crucial elements of an intelligence assembly and not really feeding into action in the way that it should do. In healthcare, there's, again, a lot of promising ideas. AMI is one, Artificial Intelligence for Medical Epidemics, which has a whole set of tools for spotting emerging epidemics of things like dengue fever or Ebola, often using gamified methods to encourage the public to report on these outbreaks, using AI then to predict how they might spread in a population, and then linking into public health workers to stop the disease spreading. And we begin to see in things like AMI, again, the beginning of how a global brain really could be organized and orchestrated on hugely important issues like epidemics. MetaSub does this for bacteria and antibiotic resistance. It tracks the state of bacteria in subways around the world. On the left there, you see the map for the New York subway and all the different pathogens to be found there, including quite a few plagues. So next time you go, just be aware you probably are touching a plague. But the idea there, and they've got 80 cities now linked up, is to create a sort of global brain of the state of the biome in order that the world can respond much more quickly when antibiotic resistance spreads. And as we have said many times from Nesta, this is one of the biggest threats to the world. It could kill tens of millions of people in the next few decades if it's not dealt with. So another promising example, and then in a very different field, democracy. Over the last few years, we've been developing tools for collective intelligence in democracy. They're in use in many cities across Europe, but I think even better than what we've done is what Taiwan is doing under Minister Audrey Tang with V-Taiwan, where the parliament organizes a much more structured way of making laws, where they start off trying to get the facts, and stakeholders and ministries post what they think the facts are on a kind of wiki timeline. Then using the Polis AI tool, they look at options and deliberate, have open both face-to-face gatherings and online ones, and then a decision is made by Parliament or by ministers, but which uses the collective intelligence of the society, not government by tweet, not government by yes-no referendum, not government by just expecting the people at the top of all political parties to know the answers. And to me, this is very much the direction of the future. Last year, Nesta published a survey of similar experiments around the world. This is beginning to gather pace, the idea that democracy doesn't have to go backwards, downhill, could be reinvented for the 21st century. But of course, it's not hard to see the people who stand in the way of doing that. So where does this all head? Well, we think the crucial sort of prospect of the next few years is not just AI. AI is fantastic. At Nesta, we've invested in AI. We do AI projects. We convene. But it's the combination of AI plus CI, machine and humans, which probably gives us our biggest benefits. But what we need to do that is what we call intelligence design. And one of the really striking things about all the projects that I've shown you is the people working on them are sort of making it up as they go along. There are not schools of intelligence design in any universities or businesses or governments. At the moment, there's a striking gap there where we have very strong schools of data science and computer science and psychology, but not for the design of the intelligence that matters most to us. So what we're working now at Nesta is creating a center for collective intelligence design to be very practically focused on how do you do this well. What lessons do we learn? How do you avoid bias? How do you organize the mix of human meetings and online? How do you harvest data? How do you mobilize the creativity of very large crowds? And we're going to do that through quite practical projects, showing what that means in different fields. Some, I hope, will be in democracy. Some will be in healthcare, some in education, and one which we published a bit on just last week was applying this logic to jobs and labour markets. How in a city, like an Edinburgh or a Birmingham or a London, do you organise all the data, all the knowledge about jobs in that city, and tap, in addition, the human insights of young people, employers, etc., and make that a commons, make that a shared tool, which we've called Open Jobs. We've done some beta versions of this, of things like skills profilers, tools for teenagers, and so on. But we see a hugely important sort of part of our future in the next few years is things like this, which are collective intelligence tools, which then allow people the freedom to make their own choices. This is a substantially empty space at the moment. There's a huge amount of small-scale creativity and startups and projects and experiments. We're trying to pull them together to put our foot down on the accelerator in terms of helping them grow, helping them collectively learn lessons from each other, and helping to ensure that at least a tiny bit of the billions and billions going into AI now actually also goes into the human element, the AI plus CI. And I'd be very surprised if there aren't a lot of people in this room who can help us do that. So please get in touch. Please join with us. This is a project which launches properly in September. And of course, a project on collective intelligence design has to be a collective project. So we need you. Thank you.